morning, everybody. Welcome to the Idaho Department of Labor's opening installment for the 2025 Labor Market Insight Series from the Idaho Department of Labor Economists. My name is Craig Shaul, and I'm the Labor Market Research Supervisor here at the department and your host. Technically, I'm a Research Analyst Supervisor, but kind of gives more of a context of what it is I'm doing here. Normally at this point, I provide a quick LMI update as people are, as a stop start, as people are getting logged on. But today, since that's one of our sections, I'll just kind of get to the meat of our boilerplate intro. But again, what we'll be talking about this today is just we're just talking about the current economy and some of the topics we expect to have our attention in 2025. A couple of standard notes before we start. This presentation is being recorded and will be uploaded to YouTube for later viewing. You will all receive a link to access this video, along with a link for our website that has all the recordings from our previous Labor Market Insight series, where you can view any of those at your leisure, but also the other videos that the Department of Labor produces from other parts of our department. And then one quick plug for launch before we get started. I just want to remind everybody about launch, Idaho's trailblazing new approach to ensuring Idaho students stay in Idaho to fill rewarding, good-paying, in-demand jobs. It covers 80% of the cost, up to $8,000, for an Idaho graduating high school senior to enter an Idaho-based workforce training or education program, which is linked to an in-demand career. Launch is transforming the lives of Idaho students and giving opportunities they never had before. If you'd like more information or just curious, please go to idaholaunch.com. All right, so today's webinar, like I said, will be a review of, sure I have it right here. All right, cool. Will be a review of the current labor market stats to kind of set the stage for how Idaho is doing for this transition from 2024 to 2025, and also set the context for what we'll be kind of talking about here in our discussion phase. Our intention for this webinar that you're all joining us for is to be kind of an organic discussion between myself and my colleagues here that are with me. In short, we'll be providing the labor market statistics and also some of these topics in 2025 that we're kind of paying attention to just as we're kind of moving into the new year. Joining today are two of my colleagues. The first is Jan Roeser. He's the labor economist for the Southwest region of the state. Thank you for joining us, Jan. And then also Ryan Whitesides, who is in Idaho Falls and covering the eastern portion of Idaho. Thank you for joining us today, Ryan.
Happy to be here. Thanks for inviting me on.
Great. And then just one kind of note. There's names on the slide there. And one note when we get into the question, the topics. You know, what we express here maybe not necessarily. It shouldn't be taken as you know. It's just the topics we're looking at as part of what we're our bandwidth as part of our jobs. Our selection of the topics or the discussion today shouldn't be taken as as any kind of implication or recommendation, any kind of policy. It's mainly just a discussion of the topic. So, and the data we have to kind of help provide that context. So, with that, it's kind of an even split between a greater rate than last year and the same as last year. So that kind of is optimistic, I would say. But also, it's interesting. There's a similar spread between slower and not sure. So, do you guys have any context on that response or that result, Jan?
Sure, always. I actually tend to believe we will continue to expand. Just we have so much investment going on in construction across the state, particularly in my area. I feel like we have a really robust investment going on. But I also see a few clouds on the horizon. There's some concerns about the interest rates as far as our single family home construction. I think people are finally getting over the hump about that interest rate. They're deciding we've got to make a move. So I'm not totally held back by the interest rates, but it is a little bit of a cloudy future as far as that goes with our construction and home building. We have so many subdivisions that have been approved, but I know the builders are a little hesitant and the public is a little hesitant. Across the nation, the home sales have been going down over this last year, but in Idaho, we've seen a little bit of a rebound towards the last part of the year, and maybe it has something to do with a few of those rate cuts that shouldn't directly impact the mortgage rates, but they seem to. There is definitely a correlation. Um, anyway, yeah, there's a lot of uncertainty though too. So, I'm really couching what I say.
How about you, Ryan?
Well, I would tend to agree also. The labor market confidence and the consumer confidence are kind of two different silos, if you will. Consumer confidence might be low when the interest rates are high, but I would say that labor market confidence is a lot higher and not proportionate to what a consumer might be feeling. So yeah, I would say with interest rates, that would kind of directly or indirectly tie in with what the labor market would do. So yeah, I would say labor market confidence is higher than consumer confidence as far as the outlook.
Well, great. And I would agree with you both on those. I think it's interesting that the spread, it kind of matches, to be honest, how we kind of view the economy. And when we're trying to answer the questions, what we expect for Idaho for the next year or two, it kind of like, well, we expect it to kind of continue, all things being considered, but we maybe take a conservative approach to it at the same time. So we'll get more into that here in a minute. But we'll launch into provide the review of our labor market statistics and kind of review last year and then kind of talk about what that portends for 2025 at this point. So last Friday, we released Idaho's unemployment situation for December 2024. For those of you who got the release and know Idaho's unemployment rate stood at 3.8%, which is up a tenth from 3.7 from November. Which is also up from last year in December. It was 3.3%. So that's 0.5% increase. And then since we're at the end of the year, the average for 2024 at this point is 3.5% as an average, which is up from 2023's average of 3.1%. So we're kind of in this kind of upper bound of unemployment that we haven't seen for quite some time in the normal course of things. But comparing that to national unemployment rate changed little from November to December. It went down 4.1 to 4.1% from 4.2. However, the nation added 256,000 non-farm payroll jobs from November to December, which was a very strong showing. And actually probably lends to, in terms of national policies, lending to the federal market open committee probably going to keep interest rates level or kind of taking at least a conservative approach to those, just because again, don't want to see a hot labor market push up costs and then get lose control of inflation again. So when you compare our unemployment rate of 3.8% to what Idaho's rate has done historically, what's interesting is that, again, like I mentioned, we're up above what we've been living in for the last probably
Yeah.
7 or 8 years, except for the pandemic, which obviously is an outlier situation. But it's also, we've been conditioned to like, well, if any of you are out there thinking 3.8% or even the averages are going up, that must mean that the economy is, there's some extra slack. There's concern that we're slowing down. That's not it at all. It's actually, we're kind of getting back to that normal range where it's easier for employers to find workers. And it's not quite as tight, but it's still tight, I should mention. But looking at how that rate compares to the average of the last few years, it's from 2016 to 2024, the average was 3.5%. So we're just now poking up above that. But we were at below 3% for a number of years since 2018. I think it was a 24-month consecutive stretch under 3% before the pandemic hit. And then just because I've said it so many times before, I'll say it again. We're at the record low unemployment for March 2020 was our record unemployment. I think it was 2.4% or 2.5, but then the next month it was at the highest, which was 11.8 that we've ever had. Then immediately come back down and we were back to zero, or we were back to, sorry, that's a non-farm, back to zero. But our unemployment rate recovered back to below 4% by the end of the year again. So, but this again, this 3.8%, as we get into the next slides, we'll show you that it's not really a concern of the labor or the economy slowing down per se. It's actually good news for both job seekers and employers that things are a little bit, labor market's a little less tight. And by the way, Ryan, Jan, both, if you have any questions or any points of interest as we're going, please feel free to interject.
Did you mention we went over 1 million on our civilian labor force this last month?
That's coming up, but yeah, good point.
Oh, okay, sorry. I just think it's amazing how our civilian labor force has grown over these last 5 years. It's just huge, and so there's always going to be a little bit of a lag as these unemployed people shift into jobs that have come to our state. So, anyway.
Yeah. And this slide really here, that's one of my points about how we're looking at total non-farm. So we're looking at jobs here. So these are the opening or the positions that people are working in the employer they're working for. So, and this is actually, it's 14.6. The tool I have to update this, BLS has not. I just released the data today, and I haven't had a chance to update it. It's actually 14.6%. For December 2024, above where we were the previous pandemic, the previous peak before the pandemic, which is February 2020, March. I think they've kind of moved the numbers a little bit, but we're 14.6%. We're the leading state in the nation in terms of the percentage change, percentage increase of jobs post-pandemic. Utah is number 2, 12.6 in terms of November. And then the US is actually at 4.7%. That number is current for December. This US releases their rates or their numbers 2 weeks before the states do. So 4.7% is correct. So you can see the spread between Idaho's growth in non-farm jobs versus the US average. I think there's still a couple states that still have yet to recover. I think one, I forgot what they were, but there's just a couple that are still under. But obviously Idaho is leading the way, and the labor force, to Jan's point, is really kind of what's pushing those non-farm jobs. Without that population growth that's feeding the labor force for us, we wouldn't be seeing the jobs getting filled like they are. The demand for workers in Idaho, even though we've been looking at a tight labor market for the last few years, that in-migration, that labor force increase is what's really been kind of keeping that current going and that boat afloat in that way. So,
as we're quantifying the non-farm employment, Craig, since June, we've added 3,000 jobs monthly since June. So that's kind of an amazing way to quantify it if we're looking at percentages also. Continued in-migration and labor force growth is only going to feed into that.
I think you're right, and I think that's one of the things that has kept even though the population increases, and Jan could speak more to this in detail, but the population increases that Idaho's seen has moderated somewhat compared to, at least especially during the pandemic year and post couple years after that. But before, we were at 1.92% growth, and now we're at 1.4, 1.5. And then, so it's one of those things where it really kind of, we expect it to continue at that 1.5 more moderated pace, which is still very healthy growth, but perhaps not quite as breakneck pace as what we've seen. But still, to Ryan's point, that 6,000 jobs from June, I mean, the average we've seen so far for the non-farm increase from 2023 to 2024, it's about almost 3%. It's 2.9% at this point. So that's almost, and Idaho's year after year has been around 3%. There's been a couple of slower years, but it's still above 2 or around 3 is usually where we find ourselves with non-farm job growth.
Craig, I was going to jump in and just say you mentioned Idaho is moderated as far as population growth, but so have the other states too. When we were up in the top echelon, let's call it the number 1, number 2 spots, it was especially during the pandemic. I mean, those were really big growth rates, 3%. But now the highest is right around 1.7, 1.8. 1.9. So everybody else is moderating too. I think the interest rates have slowed some mobility that's occurring out there. Just organically, people would move, but yet they're not sure that they want to do that right now. And there was so much chaos as far as people quitting too during the pandemic. I think people have kind of wanted to settle down a little bit in their jobs.
Yeah, that's a good point. Thank you, Jen.
Hey, Craig, it looks like we do have a question in the Q&A, just asking, how do you track the jobs added?
So that is through a statistical program, a cooperative program that the Bureau of Labor Statistics runs in cooperation with each of the 50 states and territories. It's called here we call it the Current Employment Statistics. If you read the BLS report, it's the Establishment Survey, and they survey, and there's a couple components to it, and long story short, and maybe we actually need to do a webinar on that because but basically it's employers nationwide are polled or provide their it's a selected sample of employers. It's 600,000 nationwide. I forget what Idaho's portion of that is. Basically they classify by industry, and then they ask each employer how many jobs they had on the 12th of a given month from one month to the next, and then they kind of measure the difference between those, and that's how you get the jobs changed. In addition, that is benchmarked by what's called the Quarterly Census of Employment and Wages, which is the administrative records program, which is the core to all of that, and really kind of without it, none of this stuff would be possible. It is the data that is provided as employers submit their unemployment insurance taxes. So from that, we get industry and employment, and that for the state side anyway, that's really what provides, for most of the year, we're providing an estimate from the Establishment Survey, and what we're getting ready to do after our December release and what we're currently doing is the benchmark, where we replace as much data as we can with the Quarterly Census of Employment Wages. The reason we don't use that for estimates is it takes time to gather and clean it, and so there's a lag. So hopefully that makes sense. But like I said, we might need to do a whole webinar on it. So good question though. All right, so the next slide is really just about our kind of a measure of our labor market tightness. And I will admit that mess at the right, where you have 0.9, all those numbers all together, is a mess, and I apologize for that. But I think it's important to kind of keep it this way, just because kind of to point out how these numbers are converging now. For the last few years since the pandemic, and we took looking at a worker shortage, and employers couldn't find workers. They were desperate to find workers, couldn't fill them. And we had a job opening ratio of 2.8. So there were 2.8 jobs open for every unemployed person looking for work in Idaho. That has since come back down, and we're actually almost back to where we were pre-pandemic, 0.9%. And actually those two lines, and what that's showing is that the number of people in Idaho for December 2024 is now a little bit less than the open job positions, but they're kind of at parity when you just looking at it from an estimate standpoint. So we're kind of back to where we would be in a normal situation. And actually those two numbers, the unemployment rate, the unemployed number should probably actually be under that job posting number to be kind of more of less of a breakneck pace, I think. But what's interesting, and reason, like I mentioned before, why we're not, we don't look at the unemployment rate going up as an indication of things slowing down. It's actually just that there's more people joining the labor force, and more people are unemployed, but they're looking for work, but they're generally being absorbed. And what the bottom, the dashed line, the job seeking unemployment insurance claimants, those are people that have lost their job and are looking for work and are getting unemployment insurance benefits. I'll just point out that number, it's at 5,000 and change for December 2020 or 2024, which is the average for that month. But I would just point out how low that is compared to the number of unemployed people that are looking for work. How level it's been, even as Idaho's economy has expanded by leaps and bounds over the last few years, it really hasn't gone up by a lot, not even proportionally to what you would expect employment to do. So again, that's kind of an indication that Idaho's economy is really functioning pretty well. And what we're seeing with the unemployment rate going up a little bit is that there's just a little bit less pressure on employers. And if there's any employers listening, you've probably experienced, and if you've been hiring the last year compared to previous years, you've probably had an easier time of it with the candidates that are applying than we did in 2022, even 2023. Jan, Ryan, any comments on this before I move to the next one?
Yeah, definitely less employer intensity, like as far as job opening intensity. It's tighter as the supply of jobs goes down. And I don't think it's a commonplace thing to have full employment 1-to-1, like one job to every job seeker. So we are kind of normalizing a little bit, but it is not a common occurrence to have that type of this little of intensity as far as that's concerned.
Yeah, I agree with you, Ryan. I mean, the labor market's so fluid. People are moving in and out all the time. And so really to find one little photograph of it is really hard and have it be in equilibrium. I did want to add that one of the things that makes me feel warm and fuzzy, let's say, confident for the next year is just the fact that we have over 7,300 job postings out there just for my region alone. Now, there's job postings all across the state. There's demand all across the state. And most of these job postings, not most of the job postings, but a good percentage of these job postings come from places like hospitals and schools that are doing multiple openings. So 7,300 is conservative, and the amount that Craig has up there too is at 37,000 job openings, job postings. That's yeah, that's going to be conservative too, because we know that at any given hospital there's going to be like 1 million RN openings and CNA openings. It's just life. And truck drivers. We all need truck drivers in every region. So,
Yeah, good point on that. So, yeah, thank you for your input there. So, all right. So next slide, and then, well, next slide almost. PowerPoint. There we go. So, this slide here, we're looking at the as for those of you who've been on our webinars before or have been paying attention to some of our releases, the Idaho Department of Labor for the last 2 years has been conducting its own survey, which we've named the Idaho Business Climate Survey. So we've conducted 2 consecutive years, 2023 and 2024. And we have the results. They're basically the top concerns of the results of those 2 surveys here for each consecutive year. And then we have 2023 on the left in the dark gray blue, and then 2024 in the lighter blue. And then we have the difference in rates. I didn't have a different number for the supplier cost of workers because it really is the same, 31 and some change. It didn't really move a whole lot, although it did go down a little bit, but just not enough to really make a big difference between 31 or anything like that. So that's why it's 31. That's probably TMI, but the big takeaway from this, however, is that even though last year the top 2 concerns for early in 2023, labor was the top concern when you combine them 53.5% of employees responded to the survey. Labor, supply, or cost of workers, and also the high turnover were the 1 and 2 top concerns at that point. And which made sense. That was 2023. We're kind of still in that higher tightness, where that almost at the waning edge of the worker shortage period post-pandemic. So it made sense. And then 2024, like I said, if you're an employer that's hiring, you probably had a little easier time of it. Our unemployment rate was a little bit higher on average. So it kind of makes sense that the high labor turnover has diminished in terms of a top, it's still the 3rd top concern, but it's not the 2nd. But still, when you combine the 2, the combined labor is still the top concern between 2023 and 2024. Just it's not, the labor turnover is kind of seems to be less of a concern than it was before. However, the supply and/or cost of workers is still a concern for the top. I thought was also interesting is that there's kind of on the non-labor supply things. Taxes was more of a concern in 2024 than 23, and then some other kind of residual concerns as well. But for the lion's share, it's this certainly labor is the kind of top concern. Ryan, Jan, any comments on the results that we're seeing here?
Well, I can speak to Eastern Idaho a little bit. The wholesale concerns that businesses had are the same as they are in Eastern Idaho. That would be the supplier cost of labor and non-labor inputs. This was a smaller sample size of respondents in Eastern Idaho, so I'm being very careful on this, but they did mention that cost of recruitment and compensation of employees was a high concern in Eastern Idaho. And then just the general costs of doing business. Those were kind of the hierarchy of those concerns that these respondents had on this side of the state. Pretty consistent with kind of what the statewide feedback was on this survey. The skills needed by workforces in the next 5 years was kind of an interesting one too that I took away. Advanced computer skills and time management. Those were the biggest ones as far as that hierarchy of respondents in Eastern Idaho.
I'm a little concerned about the declining demand, that they feel like that's going to happen with continued population growth, which I don't think we will see that fall off. I don't think that's going to happen. It is just slowing down a little bit, normalizing. But on another point, I think the labor hoarding has helped with some of the labor force issues. I think people are just holding on to those individuals they have and just seeing what's happening as part of that uncertainty. But also, I think people are more aware of the fact that we really don't have the population to fill in for those jobs that the baby boomers are retiring from. I think it's finally struck everybody that, gosh, this is the reality. We have smaller families. We don't have the capacity to backfill those jobs. And artificial intelligence, we're hoping will come in, but we're not real sure about that either. So there really continues to be a lot of uncertainty, Craig.
Yeah, good point. Which leads us into our next slide, and actually, I won't spend a lot of time on this so we can get to our discussion. But basically, and it's what we said before, is that it's Idaho's labor force growth, which is being fueled by its population increase, which is what is kind of the difference between, what's fueling Idaho's tremendous economic and labor market growth that we've seen for the last few years. And we expect that to continue because, like as Jan said, even though population increases have moderated nationwide, Idaho's still at the top range of what are receiving at the top end of the states are receiving in migration and population increases. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and kind of move into our discussion period. The whole question is, what do you think will be the biggest challenge facing the state's economy this year, 2025? And then you have cost of living, housing affordability, job opportunities, education, workforce development, and other. Right? Housing affordability is by far the number one contender or the number one result. I think that makes complete sense. Cost of living, inflation. I think that is very consistent with what we've been seeing throughout the economy. What's interesting is that there's some job opportunities, education, workforce development. Others are taking kind of are still getting populated, but by a minority on that one. So that's interesting. So Jan, what's your take on that?
I would have answered cost of living and inflation because I've got housing fatigue. But quite frankly, I'm finding that it's been uplifting to see the last year's progress in housing, at least in my area. I have to speak to it, not the rest of the state necessarily. But there's been a lot of municipalities that have jumped into the affordable housing fray, and it's not for low income people, it's for working people, middle working people that we need in our communities. We need protective services. They don't get paid a huge wage. Nurses, they get paid well, but not a huge wage. Same with teachers. And we need all of these folks in our communities, and they need to be able to be young, coming out of college, work for a few years, and be able to buy a home for their families. And it is hard. So you're seeing in the tourism area, uh, the the private sector jumping in and helping out, particularly the school districts and the hospitals, and finding in those mountain towns like McCall, and I'll speak for South Central too in Blaine County. They're building that housing, and then Boise City's building apartments in which it's more of a sliding scale so that people can afford to at least get in somewhere and have it be 30% or less of their income. So, I am I do think, and childcare was another one. We're seeing more private participation in helping their workforce with childcare, knowing it's such a big demand on the wallet these days. So, I am inspired by some of the solutions we're finding.
Yeah. Ryan, any response on that poll result?
Yeah, the poll is kind of interesting. Again, I'll go back to the consumer confidence outlook. That poll, I think we had 51 people responding. Their consumer confidence far is not as confident as it would be as far as the labor market. The labor market was a low concern. Consumer confidence regarding inflation, housing prices, that seemed to be kind of more of a hot button. Interesting result from this poll.
Well, I mean, we're going to talk a little bit more about that here on one of our topics, but why don't would you want to talk more about that now, or do you want to go with immigration? I mean, what would make sense to you guys?
I tend to believe immigration's
Yeah,
going to be such a
me
hot
too.
button this next year, and it very well could add to our inflationary uh, results. When you start looking at, particularly at Idaho, let's just look at Idaho. I did notice a Pew survey that was out there. Idaho, as far as its percentage of immigrant residents, it's only about 5.7%. So that's pretty low as far as the nation. Our share of the population is 5.7%. However, I don't think that includes some of the guest visas that we depend on, uh, that are here temporarily. H-2A workers, I think there were 6,500 that came in. I don't think they're included in our non-farm. I know they're not included in our non-farm, obviously, because they're H-2A agricultural workers. But we have such great demand for workforce, and the fact that we may not have those individuals to help us get our commodities out of the fields, or our gallons of milk to the plants. And it's a pretty grave concern, and it makes me think that they will address it. It's a concern in each of our states. I mean, sometimes I think New York City, they're not going to have much ag. That state has a lot of ag. They are vying with Idaho at any given time to be one of the top 5 dairy producers. So everybody has, some amount of game that they need to stay in that game with their ag workers, and the fact that that might be pulled back. The illusion is that when we have people coming in to help us with our economy, which is I think the GDP is estimated at 3.1%. We could not have done that without that mass immigration that came in, because we really are short of jobs, of workers for our jobs. And I get real passionate about this, but I really believe that we need to find some solutions. And I think absolutely it should be documented, and we just should have a clearer way to have workers come in and help us out. Um, when I look at the wages, one of the big concerns is that, okay, we have people coming in from other countries working here. They're going to deflate our wages for our workers. And most of the individuals, unless you're looking at the H-1B program, which is the highly educated guest visa programs, most of the workers that are coming in either across the border or with the H-2A programs really are working some of the lower skilled jobs that we have. And they probably do keep those down a little bit, but we still see growth in that. So I was looking at the dairy workers. We have about 7,200 dairy workers. And if you talk to the Idaho dairymen, they will say that organization will say we're afraid a lot of them are flying under the radar and have documentation that may not stand muster if really scrutinized. If those folks all go away, that would be very harmful to our economy, of course. But when looking at the growth that they've had over the last 10 years, it's about 12%, but their wages have gone up 53%. So I think we're acknowledging that we need all of these workers, no matter their skill level. They all have a valid place in our economy. And I'm heartened by that. And all of these individuals pay taxes. They also have larger families, which we tend to need. We could use a little bit of a stronger base down in the lower ages when we look at our age pyramid. And so, the case is that I think we will find that our leadership going forward will see the wisdom of finding a better method of doing immigration than we've had in the past.
Yeah, that's certainly, I mean, that work, that source of worker has certainly been integral to those industries in Idaho. It'll certainly, yeah, I agree with you, Jan. It's, the potential impact that would be pretty substantial. So I would, obviously,
Yeah.
don't know what's going to happen at this point, but it's something certainly on our radar for 2025. That's for sure, because it will be impactful.
Sure. And it's not only agriculture, our construction workforce, our landscapers. A lot of those individuals depend on some type of documentation typically, and it's something everybody's concerned about. So yeah, thanks, Greg.
Sure. And then Ryan, you're actually we'll go to the next question because it's amazing how time flies. But I think so. We're going to talk. Ryan, you were looking at higher education enrollment and demographics. And what was your concern there? What's the nagging question you have for 2025 for that?
Well, basically just kind of the big important question of the influx of college student enrollments, how that would affect labor market void of retirees and baby boomers, and demographically speaking. Our real first wave of retirement started in 2020, and then we're projected to have that wave of early retirees and continued retirees after they're 65 into the next decade. So I will say that when we're talking about kind of future forecasts and things like that, these are based on projection models. They're quantitative. There can also be qualitative insights that we get from empirical data and things like that. But we do speak of projections and forecasts, and we use those here at Labor. But first of all, it's forecasted by 2032 that there will be 433,000 retirement age citizens 65 and over in Idaho. And that's 67,000 more people than would be retiring this year in 2025. And not necessarily all of these citizens are going to be in the workforce. These are just retirement age people. But we are projecting a 15% increase in retirees. So then we talk about an enrollment cliff and kind of how that ties in with higher education. The other question, kind of the things that I've been researching is if in-state college enrollment growth continues with graduates in Idaho, will they stay here and work here? And then the retirees leave behind a lot of late career type positions. So a lot of the mid-career people, we might see a shift into those late career roles. And then the influx of the enrollments in higher education would, in theory, be able to replace a lot of the entry-level positions as that shift takes place. So This makes way for new college graduates and technical school graduates to be hired in the workforce and kind of help their job security. And but basically, the enrollment cliff, there's no real enrollment cliff here in Idaho. That's the remarkable thing. We've seen a lot of growth in higher education. I'll just give you some examples, a few data points of the state universities. The University of Idaho first-year enrollment recently climbed by over 8%. University of Idaho had the largest recent freshman class in history, and Boise State's first-year in-state enrollment recently increased by 12%. Idaho State, same thing, first time undergraduate enrollment recently increased by 3%, which is highest for them this decade. And then Lewis and Clark, first time full-time enrollment recently grew by 16%. So that just kind of begs the question, if these graduates are going to choose to stay here and be part of the workforce here in Idaho, which is incentivized by the Idaho Launch Program that we kind of touched on in the outset, will that help that the mass retiree demographic shift that will happen and replacing those late career workers? So that's kind of some of the things that I've been looking at. They both tie into one another. It's an encouraging prospect in consideration of filling future state labor force needs, especially that we do have an expanding aging labor force.
Thanks, Ryan. It's interesting that you talk about that, and I think your next topic kind of leads into it. But before we get to it, I'm just gonna, I was talking to our colleague Lisa and Lewiston, and to that end, in terms of like, how is Idaho faring, and what does that look like? I think she was talking about how like on the other side of the state border is Washington State University. They're seeing unemployment rise. That county is seeing unemployment rates rising. But also their enrollment is shrinking, whereas U of I, on the other side of the border, is seeing enrollments go up, and unemployment, as we've looked at, it's kind of staying level. It's not really going up by much. So, but I think all of our universities are kind of seeing an enrollment increase in the last few years, and that seems to be something, again, with our population increase, labor force increase. That's something that Idaho seems to be kind of enjoying right now. Ryan, why don't we go to you had a poll question on youth employment outlook. I think that's a good segue into that in terms of how it looks for Idaho. All right, so this is actually a poll question. Sorry, it says trivia, but how confident are you about available career opportunities for Idaho youth entering the workforce in the next 5 to 10 years? And then we have basically the Likert scale of very confident to very unconfident, with variation in the middle. So no one said somewhat confident, so they're either somewhat, so there's two somewhat confident. Apparently that's somewhat unconfident, I'm going to guess, actually, just in terms we have it. So sorry about that again. So it looks like there's 27% say very confident, no one says somewhat confident. But there seems to be some uncertainty or pessimism in this one. Ryan, as you're kind of talking about this, how does this poll result strike you?
Well, I have children between the ages of 1 and 14 right now, 4 boys. We can kind of look at this as a grassroots approach at the K through 12 level. One of my sons is being homeschooled. The other 3, the other 2 are in public school. The other one will be starting public school when he's 5. But I can say that enrollment in Idaho's regular K through 12 public schools has kind of leveled off in the recent past. But the saving grace to that is there's more people taking advantage of private school, charter enrollment, and homeschooling in the past 4 or 5 years, actually. So that's on the rise statewide, even though there might be a regular public school drop-off. But the class sizes are a little small. My first grader goes to a class of 16 kids. When I was in first grade, I had 30 plus kids in my class in Utah, large class sizes. So the smaller class sizes are helping the learning, fostering the learning. It's good news for post-secondary institutions with the rise in non-traditional schooling with the go-on rates. If they sustain or increase, I think that's going to bode well and continue for state higher ed institutions. And provide a consistent feeder into the school systems, and then in turn the labor market. So I think people are going to still be having children here in Idaho, where we are a family-oriented state. I think it's population-wise, I think natural population growth is going to continue. We'll still have that growth and that the need for public school. But yeah, I think that's going to bode well ultimately for the labor force in keeping that momentum from K through 12 into higher ed and the labor force and beyond.
Thank you, Ryan. I think that given the the concern about retaining Idaho's youth and having opportunities, I know that there's kind of a there's a difference in numbers and feel, I think, but I think one of the nice things about the launch program is that it's kind of designed to kind of connect them with in-demand careers in Idaho. So with the intention that they would stay in Idaho and work and find good paying jobs in the economy in their region or in the state. So so with that, I think we'll circle back to Jan, and then we have the final question we have for our occasion.
So this is asking which private, so drop government off of that, which private industry experienced the greatest average annual wage growth at 7.5%. So you have information, construction, manufacturing, agriculture, or healthcare and social assistance. There is one answer. And this is based on 2024 data, which is the first 3 quarters, we don't have the 4th quarter completed yet. So the answer is information. And typically that would not be something anybody would respond to, as you can see by the responses of 12% people thinking it's information. And they may have talked to me because I've been surprised by this. Information is
Information answer or construction?
it's information.
Okay.
Yeah. Oh, pardon me. Okay, there's 2 parts to the answer. You're right, it's construction as far as 7.5%. The largest average annual wage, though, is in the information sector, and that's what surprised me. So sorry, I have my spreadsheet up. Construction has been booming. We all know that. There's a shortage of housing across the nation, but we've also had a backlog of maintenance on our roads, bridges, and all that's being addressed. Not all of it. Parts of it are being addressed by some of the funding that we've gotten over the past 5 years. And so we have crews out working on all of that, but we also have a lot of commercial and industrial activity going on, at least in my region, and that's all I'm probably able to speak to at this point. But I mean, we have projects on the airport, we have projects at Boise State University, we have apartment buildings still going in across the city, but also in Nampa and Caldwell. Middleton has plans to have 2,500 new homes in the next 15 years. It's really crazy how people are addressing this and planning, because they know if they don't plan, there's going to be issues. Now, the wage for construction, just so you're aware of that, is at $62,490 for 2024. For information, it's $94,307. Now, in the past, we've always had manufacturing being our greatest average annual wage. So just taking the total wages that are submitted with our covered employment, this doesn't include self-employed people that work for the railroad. It's a very select people that are covered by unemployment insurance premiums and submit that information. When we divide that by the employment, typically it would have been manufacturing. We have a very large semiconductor industry here. They paid out quite high wages, but it's going through some transitions as it expands its campus and changes into a research and development area. And so we've seen a lot of onesies and twosies moving to the area over this pandemic. When I look at the list of information companies, which includes a lot of software development, a lot of web developers out there, onesies and twosies, over 500 of them are making between $100,000 and $1 million. And so that has really skewed our data for sure. And other types of companies that show up in the information include movie theaters, which have part-time employment, pretty close to as low as we can get to minimum wage, those type of jobs. And also librarians. Some of our librarians make a livable paycheck, but a lot of them are part-time workers working in libraries and around our communities. And so some of those jobs just don't add up to this 94,307 that we're seeing. So it really is these individuals that are working in tech across our state.
I mean, with the interest rates and like you mentioned, you have housing fatigue. I mean, it's the housing market in the last decade has really kind of transformed considerably to what it was, before, like even the, Great Recession, I would say, the housing market bubble. But what has been consistent for the last decade plus is wherever we go in Idaho is, stakeholders are always talking about housing is the issue to attract workers. I remember going into mountain communities and talking about how they had people with like nursing degrees or medical professionals that were from the area that were looking to come back and couldn't afford the housing. So it's like there's it's one of those things where it's just it's a continuing problem, I think, or a continuing challenge. It's not just Idaho. I mean, it's it's a global issue. Really.
Yeah.
So
egg and chicken.
yeah. All right. So thank you, Jan. I think we are at the 5 minutes left of our time. So I would say that if anyone has any questions or topics they'd like us to address in the last 5 minutes, otherwise I'll just do one that's kind of, I've seen it a couple of times in different articles that talk about nagging questions. We can just spend 30 seconds on it. AI, I mean, kind of the topics we were talking about, we kind of need like an additional productivity capacity for a limited workforce that we're looking at in the next, foreseeable future. But still, obviously there's that DeepSeek, the AI platform launched by a Chinese company that kind of upended a lot of things. And so there's kind of a lot of turmoil there. Do you guys have any kind of take on AI? If, I don't think the data really kind of has anything in terms of what we can say one way or another, but do you expect to see any kind of effects, or is that something on your radar for this year at all?
Yeah, I would say, since we're kind of on the educational programs and training subject, just the retooling and upskilling required for kind of a changing workforce and changing job market. I think there's going to be an increased demand for educational programs like data science and analytics, related technologies, anything related to AI. That's just going to be something that the education workforce programs are going to be adapting to. And I think that's a good problem to have. The energy to run these data centers is going to be another thing that's on everybody's mind too. That's kind of a separate topic, but yeah, that's kind of my take on it.
Yeah, and we've got Meta here in they'll be opening up in this year, hiring about 100 people at their data center. So we're going to see firsthand how much electricity they really do take. And luckily, they're looking at renewable wastewater and also handing over that facility to CUNA as a community. So it's some of these big companies have really partnered in some of the smaller states like Idaho and been a good community member. I think we can all use AI, though. I did want to add, I think particularly in the outset, all these individuals hiring in HR departments, I'm sure that they're finding it's very useful to get some good wordage, some good narrative going when they do ads or when they go out to talk to people. It just saves you some time. You have to check it. You have to make sure it's accurate. But yeah, what a time saver.
Yeah, it certainly has that potential. So, but also I think it might actually help. One of the things I've seen, David Otter, who's the MIT economist, has kind of looked at this type of thing. One of the things that he has mentioned and his assessment of this. And it's, I mean, obviously, really, the data is kind of too early to really kind of provide a real kind of numerical kind of research point, but is that just in terms of what AI can do with the chat GPTs, is it should raise the kind of level the playing field for the writing ability for people, and so that might kind of, you know, to some extent equalize the bachelors to less than bachelors a little bit for depending on the job. But I mean, that's just speculation at this point and pretty early and just kind of but definitely interesting. Well, we're at the close of our presentation. I'd like to everyone, thank everyone for attending. Really appreciate it. I would just like to say again, these are just a few of the topics that are on our minds. Obviously, there's a lot of things happening in 2025. If we didn't get to your topic, we apologize for that. But if you have a question, you're always welcome to email us at the department here. We're happy to help as much as we can. And I would just say next, be sure to tune into our next webinar. It's on the 11th of February. And Lisa Grigg will be focusing on the Port of Lewiston, which is celebrating its 50th anniversary this year. So again, I'd like to remind you about launch. If you have any questions or would like to know more about it, go to idaholaunch.com. It's Idaho's trailblazing new approach to ensuring Idaho students stay in Idaho and feel rewarding, good paying, in-demand jobs like what we've kind of talked about here with some of our topics for 2025. And I'd also remind you that the Idaho Department of Labor offers many services, which among them includes free access to labor market information, which you can get to at lmi.idaho.gov. With that, I'd like to thank you for attending. Have a great day, an excellent 2025, and be excellent to each other. Thank you.